Right. Um, and it is live, doesn't it? It says we're live on Facebook. So I'm just doing a few more little links. Hello, everybody at the What's On It Elephant and Castle Facebook page. Extremely happy and excited today that we're going to be speaking with Stewart Binns, who's geez, it's hard to describe what you are to me, Stewart. You're a mentor, you're a friend. You've never said no to me in terms of meetings and actually helping out with work in the past. I'm extremely grateful to have you in my life and to know you, and now to talk to you for the next kind of 45 minutes to our community. Really grateful that you're here today. Thank you so much for joining us. And can you kind of just tell people here a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, it's really kind of you to invite me, Nick. I'm delighted, honoured to be involved in your project, which I know a little bit about because you've been kind enough to tell me a little bit about it. So as you said, we've known each other a long time. Obviously, as time passes, you begin to forget when we met, how we met, what we did together. I can't remember most of it. I have to say, I know that you were a hockey player, and I know that you did a lot of telly and loads of stuff. And that's, I think, how we met. But anyway, I am now I think, predominantly a writer of fiction and non-fiction. The fiction I've done has been set in three main areas, really. I started trying to write 15 years ago, after a career in television, which I'll talk about in a second. I started to try and write when we moved, my family and I moved down to the southwest into Somerset, when we basically tried to get out of London and to the mad dash of London and pressured working lives and so on. So we moved down here to Somerset, and if at that point, if I wanted to carry on working in television, it would mean kind of defeating the object by having to go back to London all the time. So I'd always liked words. I didn't think I was particularly creative, but I fell in love with words in writing scripts for television. So, and obviously you need to develop certain, what I call draftsmanship skills. There are certain simple skills about any kind of writing that if you don't have a natural gift, you have to learn. So it took me a long time to learn how to write. But I think the key for me in terms of finding the passion, because I wasn't a reader as a kid, I couldn't write very well as a kid, and never thought I had any skills for it. But the key for me was in writing documentary scripts and going into a booth with someone like Ian McKellen or John Thor, or and I'm fortunate enough to work with Russell Crowe, and to discover what they could do with the right word. And that was just, it just made you shiver. If you wrote a sentence properly with the right kind of meaning, they could give you goosebumps just reading it. And I suddenly thought, wow, what words can do. So that then became the passion to start to write novels. And then there were several years of learning the grammar, learning the draftsmanship. So then I was moderately successful writing some medieval stuff. I then shifted to the First World War, which is a really important subject for me because my grandfather won a military medal in the First World War, and I was lucky enough to know him. And he never talked about the war, but he talked. I talked to him a lot about other things, and he was my father. He was actually, in place of my father, really brought me up when I was a kid, my grandfather. So I did First World War, and then my publisher said, I want you to do something more contemporary because, older history is becoming less and less fashionable. And so I then wrote something about Northern Ireland in the Troubles, because I was there as a soldier in Northern Ireland at that time, so I knew a little bit about it. And that didn't work very well, and it was a difficult, traumatic experience for me because it brought back memories of when I was in Northern Ireland, which I didn't really want to bring back. So after that, I then decided to concentrate on non-fiction. So that's what I do now predominantly. And I've got a new book coming out in April about the Eastern Front in the Second World War. before that, when you and I knew one another, we were more connected when we were both in television. I spent years working for IMG through their television arm, which was used to be called TWI. Before that, I trained at the BBC in documentary features, current affairs, and then I heard about Mark McCormack's company, which is better known as IMG, but then TWI was their television arm. And interestingly, he wanted to launch what he called an anthology of sport, which is much more an American phrase, but it was basically a weekly sports magazine show focusing on international sport, not British sport. And this was in the mid-80s. And then sports broadcasting was pretty parochial, you know, so that the Brits would have football, cricket, and so on, and the Americans would have the big four and so on, and very, very little international broadcasting in the sense of, you know, Brits watching American football or Americans watching soccer and so on. But that began to change in the 80s, and McCormack saw that coming. And for example, Channel 4 here had a huge hit with American football. And then he had a big hit with Italian football and so on. And it all began to change, and people started to take an interest in international, as we all became more international as people. And McCormack saw that coming, so he wanted a weekly magazine show for international for international coverage. And of course, to do that, it meant that you had to produce a show that was, if you change the language, was equally acceptable in France or Argentina or Japan as it would be in the English language. So we made a show that was as genuinely as international as we could make it. And McCormack was very clever because he gave me a huge budget to make it. So we could get everything in. You know, we could get hockey, we could get Formula One, we could get Aussie rules, we could get Italian football and sumo and so on. We could get all the rights. But it was a 50,000, I mean, talking about 86 here, £50,000 show in terms of its value to make, which he would sell to the Italians. He'd say, I'll sell you this for £5,000. And that's a pretty good deal, except of course he sold it 20 times for £5,000. So he made a fortune. So that was a huge thing for me. And that kicked off a career making lots and lots of programs in sport, and got a big relationship developed with the Olympics. And then when I'd done a lot of sport, I moved to my area where I spent most of my early life, training in history and so on. And then I started to make historical documentaries, focusing particularly on the Second World War and the First World War. But and that kind of brought me full circle, because we had a big hit. You know, everyone's famous for 2 minutes, aren't they? Well, 5 minutes, but I was only famous for like a minute and a half.
It's a pretty big
when we made a thing called the Second World War in Colour, which was a massive hit because everyone thought the Second World War was in black and white, because obviously all the films about the Second World War were in black and white. So that was the perception, but of course it wasn't. Well, reality was in colour, of course. In fact, when it was broadcast here, the copywriters at ITV, because it went out on ITV, wrote a brilliant line, which went on all the billboards around Britain. War is never in black and white, which is a wonderful. And anyway, so Second World War in Colour was a big hit, and that kept us going. We made Japan at War and D-Day in colour, and America at War in colour, and all that stuff. And and then at the end of that time, it was time for me to move on and come down to Somerset. So that's me full circle. Is that okay?
It's pretty darn good, Stewart. You know, I think about the Elephant and Castle community. The Imperial War Museum is just around the corner, and your connection with the wars. I know that you've actually read my thesis. I handed it to you once. It was class humor and literature as seen in diaries and memoirs of the First World War. I used my great-grandfather's diaries as a primary source of information. But the thing that I really kind of, what interests me is the passion that we have over these wars, and the lessons they have taught us. Even the thing that Melissa will probably share about what she's been feeling over the last couple of weeks with regards to watching these documentaries. But how important is it for us to be able to keep links with these wars and subsequent wars and, you know, conflicts where humanity just have butted like this, for us to be able to keep the connection going. Because I know we're in an intergenerational disconnection where it's harder for people to even, you know, especially with the pandemic, to be able to communicate, to be able to talk, to be able to share their experiences. And there seems to be a disconnect with older generations and their experiences. How do we keep it going? How do we kind of keep the interest in different generations with what's happened in the past, so that we, you know, we always say we have to learn from our past mistakes, but you know, how do we keep that connection going?
Well, I think it's difficult, Nick, because, you know, I don't know about lots of other countries, but certainly in the UK, the way history is dealt with now in schools is making it really difficult for young people to get a handle on history. I mean, I went to a very ordinary school, you know, a school for 11 plus failures. So we weren't, you know, we were trained to be engineers and, you know, working factories and things. But our history meant that we did the whole gamut. You know, we from 11 we started with the Greeks and the Romans, and by the time we got to 1415 we were in the 20th century, and we, you know, it was all very limited coverage, but we got a sense of the linear quality of history and the fact that, you know, it is the context of our existence, and that, you know, without history there is no present and there is no future. You know, and if you deny that to kids, because my boys, for example, they know a little bit about the 20th century. They happen to, for some reason, to have done the Russian Revolution. They did some stuff on Henry VIII and a little bit on the Victorians, and that's it. So how do you have a sense of our past with just those little snapshots of stuff? And that really worries me, because if you don't have history, then your life becomes very transient, and you don't understand that there is such a rich heritage from our past, which is not just all the bad things we need to learn lessons from, like the wars, but all the wonderful things that have happened that are testament to who we are as people, to who we are as human beings, and ought to be able to give us that sense of pride in what people have been able to do historically. You know, the awe-inspiring lives of, whether it's you know, Beethoven or Michelangelo or Stephen Hawking or, you know, Isaac Newton, whoever you want to name, who inspire us to live a better life or to have ambitions for ourselves. You know, so in the States, for example, I mean, I've always been passionate about American history, because when I was a kid, there were two things going on: Kennedy and civil rights. And as an impressionable teenager, those things inspired my life and molded my life in terms of my political attitudes and so on. And then when I read about history, you know, and I'm not talking about wars, because wars are easy. You know, you just think, let's not have any more wars. But it's the other things that are really important about how people, you know, and in many cases, whether that's Shakespeare or whoever, came from quite humble circumstances and had dreams and gave us things from their lives that will live forever. And those things help you find yourself as well, because obviously none of us are ever going to, no one's ever going to be Shakespeare again. But on the other hand, my boys are currently doing Shakespeare at school, and it's as always, it's taught really badly. So I sat them down and made them watch Shakespeare in Love the other day, and they suddenly got it, because they realised that actually Shakespeare was an ordinary bloke who was very talented, but he was an ordinary bloke like the rest of us. And you know, although you can't be Shakespeare again, it just makes you feel good, and it makes your life better. I don't want to talk about wars, because you say, okay, well, we learn lessons from wars, but we never do. They'll come round again. Yeah. You know, you think, how can anybody be like Hitler again? And yeah, guess what? You know, there are guys, you know, Pol Pot, and there are guys still around in African republics who, you know, as crazy as he was. So not, it bothers me talking about wars because generally we don't learn the lessons. And you know, I don't want to go on about Trump, but and Trumpism in America, but it just, what's going on in the States reminds you that you must never forget that there is a huge number of people, not a majority, but there is always a massive minority of people everywhere in all our lives who can be swayed to do extraordinarily stupid things. And, you know, we got to keep a lid on that, and we got to keep remembering that, you know, it doesn't happen just once, it happens all the time, and it keeps happening, where you get a sort of cancer growing in a community. And you say, well, think back to the Nazis. And I mean, a lot of people in America are saying, you know, America's now like Germany in the 30s, and there are similarities. Yeah. And, you know, they're worried in the States, and so they should be, because these things, these cancers keep coming back and attacking us. Anyway, that's enough.
It also, I will say, like, what you've shared is like sparking all these things. So one is this idea of inspiration, but
yep.
which I think I'll ask you or just tell a story around. But the other one is this idea of what you started off with is the power of the word, right? And like the propaganda can come with, we can almost, in my studies of Toltec wisdom, which has been a thing for me, it's the idea that words can be spells. They can cast spells. And if you use them from a place of love and compassion and unity, then nothing is actually impossible in terms of like anchoring ourselves in ourselves and creating growth and wisdom and nurturing. But then you've seen with Hitler and Trump, like using words to do the opposite, to actually cause disharmony. And so I'm just, the power of the words, when you said in the beginning, just kind of like, yeah, they are like real magic spells we can use, but it's the intention behind it, I think, that changes the course. So that's one piece. That's just my ramble. The second is the thing about inspiration. So my grandfather was in the war, World War II, both of my grandfathers. But I remember they're not going to ever be known in public as a hero of something, but they were heroes for me in my life. And my also other adopted grandfather, John, was this person who changed my life. And just by talking with him and asking him questions, not necessarily like the details of what it was like being in an environment, a war environment, but more like the resiliency, the mind, how he made friends, how he found his wife, how he grew. It's like, when we think of inspiration and inspiring people and change makers, it's not always the ones that have the platform of 1 million, 5 million followers, people, whatever. It's these little moments of just showing up in compassion and kindness and asking a question, having a conversation that changes lives, I think, and leaves a mark and going forward. And I think maybe, Nick, that's what you were alluding to before with your question, is like these conversations can be the change. That sounds so cliche. These conversations can make these changes in terms of inspiring us and leaving a mark, and then making us question, or the way, Stewart, you're teaching your kids about Shakespeare. Like, I had the exact same experience in university where I studied Elizabethan like theater, and then I was like, okay, fine. But then Shakespeare in Love actually came out that same month, and I watched it. I was like, oh, it came alive to me in a really different way. And it's so interesting to, rambling, no question. I'm just talking about inspiration and the impact we can make with our words and with having a different framework. Nick, Stewart, you go on. However you want to take it. I'm going to stop.
Good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, what I would like to kind of go into, Stewart, is this thing of like the thing about being able to look to the past, you know, for inspiration, for knowledge, but also, and I think that, you know what, how we were talking a little bit before, and I've told you about this project around tender is the new tough, and this idea around masculinity, and, you know, challenging these old ideas where what I've learned is that, you know, the masculine and the feminine are energies. It doesn't necessarily have to be whether or not you're a man or a woman, but these are energies that naturally flow. And the masculine energy for solutions tends to look to the past for solutions. And they would say things like, in the good old days, we would do this and this and this. And remember back then, let's do it like this. So for me, I'm thinking about, you know, my father growing up in Doncaster, his granddad, you know, down in the pits, and them teaching each other about, you know, being at the coalface, and what that really meant is like getting a good day's work in, and you know, make sure you're out working and you're providing and you're doing all these things. And these are the things that I learned. And I tend to kind of, when I'm in a state of fear, maybe I'm like, I'm not producing enough, I should be doing it like they did in the good old days, it tends to be a negative loop for me. When I learn kind of things about calmness, about tenderness, about compassion, which tend to be sacred feminine energies, it's about looking into the future, you know, for solutions. And I think this is something that I'd like to talk to you about, is like, how do we balance, you know, things that we learned that were positive, but also old ideas around masculinity that might be negative, and how do we start to look to each other around compassion for better solutions for the future?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation, Nick, and you know, I'm old enough to, and being brought up in the provincial north in a, you know, working class town, in the, you know, I was born in 1950. God, that was a different world from the one we have now. It's a very masculine world. I mean, for example, most pubs in my area, women didn't go into pubs. They were male preserves. And the famous Burnley Miners Club, because it was a mining town at one point, they used to have a special area for women to go into. And there was a white line in the bar across which women could not tread, because the other side of the line, the men were playing drafts for money, and they were playing snooker for money, and they were having male conversation. I went to a single sex school, so girls were a complete mystery to me, you know, until I was much older. And there was a sort of, they were unreal. They weren't like me. I mean, physically they were kind of different, and that was intriguing because we kind of didn't know how different they were. But everything about your perceptions of the opposite sex and perceptions of yourself and perceptions of sexuality were all constrained by this world that you were brought up in, which was designed to make everything different, and to keep boys and girls separate, for example. So attitudinally, it was a nightmare to get into adolescence with these strange ideas when you then started to meet girls, because they were an alien species on the one hand and attractive on the other hand, and that conflict was a nightmare. Clearly, it's a different world now. And one of the really positive things about modern times is the emergence of women into the modern world. And as not quite yet, but, and they would be the first to say so, not quite equals yet, but hugely more empowered than they used to be, where, you know, in my generation, women were supposed to stay at home and bring up kids and look after the house. Very few women worked. And one of the benefits of that is that we have a better world. I think, you know, the influence of women, and if there is such a thing, female mentality on the world, is hugely positive. And there are some great female role models now that we can follow, who change our perceptions of women, have changed our perceptions of women. I mean, for example, I remember Germaine Greer's book, The Female Eunuch, which was absolutely revolutionary. I mean, I was at university at the time, and the impact it had on male thinking about women and female women thinking about themselves was extraordinary, because she talked openly about sexuality and female sexuality. Well, those were taboo subjects, even at university in the early 60s. One of the great things about modern times is a flowering of positive ideas and ideas about equality in general. I mean, obviously the French Revolution was a long time ago, but it's only in the last few decades that genuine equality has begun to emerge in the world. Mm-hmm. And this is a sore point, but because a lot of Black Americans would still regard themselves as downtrodden. And of course they are. But when you compare the situation in the States now with how it was in the early 60s, before Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and civil rights, it is extraordinarily different. It's not different enough, but the progress has been extraordinary. And the same with the emancipation of women. And, you know, equalities in education, equalities in the workplace. I know it's not great, and the social divisions in a country like Britain are still massive, and you know, people from deprived backgrounds are still deprived. But I tell you what's a whole lot better than when I was a kid in the 50s. And so, but the important thing in that area is we all have to be positive about it. We all have to be proactive about it. We have to make it happen. Nobody's going to make it happen for us. So people who are feeling downtrodden, depressed, underprivileged, they can help enormously by fighting that and resisting that and using their strengths to resist, not to accept. And I think that's really important, because great change doesn't come from the top and people passing a new law. Great change comes from the bottom, and one by one, all of us making one little step each, putting one little brick in the wall each. That's when the wall gets really big. You know, a really good example of this is the latest book I'm doing about the Eastern Front concentrates almost entirely on the letters and diaries of the ordinary people who were suffering under the German attack. And so when you read diary upon diary upon diary from nurses, from Red Army soldiers, from civilians, from people who were bombed and people who were murdered and attacked and brutalized and so on, you realize that when you get the volume of it, and you've read hundreds of them, that actually the Soviets won the battle for the Eastern Front, not because of what Stalin did, or indeed what the Red Army did, or what, you know, regiments did, or particular guys in battles did, particular heroes. It was every single tiny little contribution from all the ordinary people, all the little people, who all had to take one step in order for the whole thing to happen. So, you know, what I'm saying is, let's all take personal responsibility for change. Let's all take personal responsibility to right the wrongs. Then, because that's how it makes a difference.
I think that's a really important piece that I think what Nick tenders and you tough is kind of wanting to address is the kind of personal accountability and also agency and sovereignty we have to really realize that we do have active choices in how we navigate the systems that we can't really control a lot of the time. So this like relationship between the micro and the macro of like, yeah, there are some things that I have no control over, like the government, like the policies, like the lawmaking. But at the same time, I am a sovereign being, and I can choose how to even chat with my neighbor, or like take time to write or meditate, or like find peace within my own being, however much trauma we come with, to know ourselves enough to know what activates us, what triggers us, what causes us to respond in kind of chaotic, problematic ways for us and also our community. So I think even in the last year with this pandemic and these things, is for me, from my perspective, when I've seen people feel okay and feel safer, it didn't really come from the top down. It wasn't about the possible vaccines or the people getting the vaccines. It was about neighbors cooking for each other and giving food. It was about checking in, how are you doing? It was about like, let's go for a walk. If we need to stay a mile apart, let's do that. But all the kind of happenings came from the bottom up, from that community, that I think is not given enough context in like actually how the change made and how people got things done was because they chose to, and their choices were not ideal, but they made that choice.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said, except you said something at the front, where at the beginning, where you said, you know, we can't change, we can't decide what the government does or something, but actually we can. mean, if, for example, Trump got 70, whatever it was, 5 million votes, more than he got the first time, but Biden got 82 million votes. And that's because that each one of them, of Americans, each one of them made a personal decision. And the same with, with the pandemic. We can only get out of this if each one of us has the vaccine. And the same way, if each one of us does as we're told to do, which is social distance, wear a mask, etc., etc. So individuals can make a huge difference. In fact, in my humble opinion, no great change has happened from the top down. All great change has happened from the bottom up by people coalescing together to make change happen. And that's very comforting because, if you think about it, we can achieve what we want to achieve. And that gives us all hope, I think, that we can create a better world. And importantly, I think you've got to hold on to a principle that I've held on to all my life, and it's a principle, which is kind of black and white. There is a whole philosophical view, and you can kind of pin it on Edmund Burke, if you like, and various others, that we're inherently wicked, and therefore we need to create systems, governments, police forces, and whatever, and rules that make us behave ourselves. Because if we don't have them, we go loopy. And Nick, you as a Canadian will probably remember the Montreal police strike, where years and years ago the Montreal police went on strike for a weekend, and there was total anarchy. People of Montreal took the place apart, and that kind of reinforced Edmund Burke's view that we're all, wicked and evil. And on the other hand, there is another view that man was born free, but is everywhere in chains. That actually the bad things in life are there because the human spirit is constrained, and you've got to. Your voice in life seems to me you've got to take one view or the other. You either think we're wicked and we need to be controlled, or you think we've got huge potential, which if we could unleash ourselves, I don't mean have police strikes, but if we could unleash our spirit and our talents and our common qualities, our common good, we could do much, much more. And I hold to that second view really strongly, even though there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. But I think we got to hold on to that we can do what we want to do, because we have such qualities, such spirit, such ambition, and that doesn't mean to change the world, but ambition for ourselves, for our families, for our loved ones, to be better people, to live better lives. It doesn't have to. You don't have to abolish inequality. But your ambition can be to use your skills to make the world go around better, to make your neighbors feel happier, and to, the whole thing, and just create the common good.
I think the perfect example of it is just what Melissa alluded to, is that the first 4 weeks of the first lockdown, I felt a community and a connection, even though I was by myself in a flat. I felt a community and a connection going out for a walk. Every person, eye contact, good morning, hello, how are you? Is there anything you need? There was this, and it was all driven from the individuals out. Everyone was in a giving, community, loving spirit. So we are capable of that.
Yep.
Without government, without anything, we are capable of that. So I like your second thing, is that I think inherently we're good. I think the spirit in us is good, and we're meant to help the other 8 billion of us on this planet. We're meant to be interconnected. But it's the systems that isolate us. And I think this is where a guy like me, who's 2 weeks away from being 50, white-bodied man who comes from privilege because I'm white, the systems, it's like, are we going to sit at the bottom? And I heard this great phrase the other day: power up, not power down. And it's what you said. Everything's going to come from the bottom. And as if we have communities start challenging, because we get complacent, we start listening to the politicians, and we start just going, okay, let's just do this to get out of it. But I think in a kind of a revolutionary way, if we all run together, enough is enough. There's been enough inequality. There's been too much diversity. We need to be more inclusive and diverse and loving. And because we know it's all about power. I've learned now about politics, all being about power to serve corporations and rich people. You know, it's not there to serve us. And I think if we rise through community, connection, compassion, and love, we can start to destabilize corporations and governments to be more community driven. And I think we're at that point, Stewart. I think we are in a pivotal point in our lives and in the planet's existence of saying enough of being controlled so much by corporations and such a small, rich portion of society.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
yeah,
not
I mean,
really a question. It's kind of more.
And you know what? That point is most relevant now because of the greatest crisis any generation has ever faced. You know, you don't have to be a scientist to realize we're buggering up the planet, not a little bit, but a lot. And you know, not only was it great telly, but the last episode of Perfect Planet was just made you shudder at the horror of what was happening. It was so brilliantly made, and there were little bits of hope in it and things, but on the whole, the statistics that, you know, suggest that we may be facing a situation where 90% of the species on the planet are going to disappear within a couple of generations is terrifying. And this is an opportunity, unlike the others I mentioned, like it's unlikely we're going to change inequality. It's unlikely, create some of the long-term social goals that we've been talking about, like complete emancipation and freedom, whatever. But the one thing that we have to do, not because it's a good idea, but because it's an absolute necessity, is change the way we're abusing the planet. And that clearly the governments have shown that they will not act. They say they're going to act, but they don't act. As you say, the corporations, not in the interests of the corporations and money to make things change, because they've got their yacht and they've got their private jet and so on and so forth. And then, you know, in 20 years' time, they'll be dead, or 30 years' time, they'll be dead, so they don't care. It is absolutely vital that young people, people younger than us, Nick, even younger than you, make positive steps. And it's growing and it's there among young people, but we've all got to help motivate them, not necessarily motivate them to demand change before it's too late. And you know, there used to be a program in the 70s called Doom Watch, which was on this very point, when led by scientists, which predicted all these, you know, problems that were going to come around the corner. And guess what? That whole thing went out of fashion. People started to, as you said, get complacent about it, began to forget. And then suddenly in the last 10 years, they've suddenly realized, hang on, this is really true. This is really happening. You know, icebergs are carving off in Greenland and Antarctica, you know, the size of whales. You know, and that's the one area I think where we've got to help young people make that change happen. And you know, there are a lot of people out there who don't care. You know, when you thankfully there is a new president in the States, but when you look at what Trump's attitude was, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, they don't believe it's happening. You know, Bolsonaro is allowing them to burn down the Amazon. I mean, so sad.
I really want to I want to know what you think about, you know, what we kind of started at the beginning about talking about in different generations and how there's like one generation just sticks to themselves, another generation sticks to themselves. So it's, you know, the silver hairs, the getting silver hairs, and the what silver hairs, you know, how like it for me, Stewart, all change in my life has happened through honest, humble conversations where I've actually been able to listen to someone for advice, where I've been able to help me to somebody. The reduction of ego has gotten out of the way where I would listen to people. How do we keep how do we start conversations, and how do we do intergenerational conversations where, you know, someone who of your boy's age thinks it's cooler to talk to maybe somebody of another generation, where they can actually sit down, be humble and listen. And also the vice versa, where I mean, I'm happy, I'm not happy. I have a hard time listening to people giving me advice on technology when I know darn well someone in their early 20s is far better at operating this than me. And it's because of ego. It's, oh no, I know how to do that. So it's, I suppose it's two parts. How do we reduce the ego enough to ask the questions? And then how do we start the conversations going between intergenerations in platforms and ideas and spaces? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, one of the few advantages of getting old is that, you know, is that you acquire wisdom. I mean, it's a great word, wisdom, because, you know, you've had lots of experiences and hopefully you've learned from some of them. And that brings wisdom. It brings a perspective on life. And perspective is something that young people tend not to have. I certainly didn't have perspective when I was a kid. I wouldn't be told anything. I mean, I thought I knew it all. And was very hard set in my views and didn't listen to anybody. Certainly wouldn't listen to anybody older than me, for sure. And so you get perspective when you're older. You get wisdom when you're older. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And therefore, it would be, you know, it would be great if young people would listen to older people. The problem is that you know, it's intergenerational stuff is the main problem with it is that when we were young, we tended to think that older people weren't particularly interesting. They weren't exciting because they, you know, they didn't dance, they didn't play our kind of music, they weren't into our kind of clothes, and so they were just old. You know, we have this terrible expression in English, fuddy-duddy. You know, dull people.
Frozen? You're frozen, Stuart.
I realized that.
Well,
Yeah, but it's frozen for me too.
yeah, okay.
Suspense.
Hopefully, Stuart will log in and log out again.
Yeah, we'll wait a couple.
Yeah.
Go, Nick. Inspiration, younger generation.
Yeah, I was really into this. Technology freezing when it freezes. So yeah, everybody, Stuart's frozen right now. I'm gonna text him. But yeah, I mean, the whole idea of intergeneration being, I think the last thing that Stuart was talking about was being a fuddy-duddy, and I certainly did have those experiences when I was younger. I was thinking that I knew everything, right, Mel?
Yeah,
Don't we all?
I mean, I think a lot of my stuff is around knowing that has been around knowing I don't know anything at all, and like being really anchored in that. Not to say I don't know things, but I really don't. None of us know anything, ever. But it's also making me realize that I think I mentioned this last week is like those conversations I had with my grandfathers were like, I didn't realize how significant and how much they'd keep me going through my life of like just values and resiliency and world perspective. So that's making me miss my grandfathers. But let's not mess that up again, right? Use the opportunities we can to connect to people who know differently. You don't have to agree either. Like that's the trick too. Like I don't agree a lot with my grandmother, so I don't consider her wise. I don't consider her a source of anything that would nurture me. But it's important to look and listen of her perspective and the stuff she had to go through to maybe make her the way she is. And that's not a judgment. I just get it because the context is so important, right? Growing up post-war Italy, like it makes you a certain way. So you can't really blame somebody for that, but you can understand why, which changes the conversation and changes my relationship with her in terms of what I expect or maybe need in terms of, like of her grandmothering me. It's really important. Like, so you don't have to agree at all, but it's really important to have those conversations and get to know the whole scope of somebody's experience, right?
Yeah.
Like
I
that's where
think the
hate
thing that
disrupted.
where I don't know if Stuart's going to be logging in before the end of the talk, but what I wanted to try to get to, Mel, is like, can we somehow create spaces for, maybe it's digital or not, but for oh, I've just got a text saying his internet has gone down.
Okay.
Hold on a second.
You're just gonna text on live, and now I'm just gonna keep talking through.
So what I wanted to talk to Stuart about was whether or not we could actually do something, because, you know, some of the most beautiful things I've ever seen on TV is when young, like not even teenage children are talking to their grandparents.
Yeah.
You know, the innocence of that, you know, grandma, what was it like when this, and then this beautiful connection happens. And I think that, you know, if there are any people out there that have grandparents, go and talk to them, go and ask them some questions and listen, sit down and listen, because, you know, the lessons that we learn from the experience of people who've been through some stuff, you know, I know this is a huge global challenge with the pandemic, but, you know, my granddad went through a lot worse, and so did Stewart's, you know, with regards to the wars and the trenches in France, you know. So we can count our blessings that at least we can stay inside today, but we have to. Yeah, sorry, you were gonna say something?
Oh no, I was just gonna say, like, even in terms of my dad, who's 75, is teaching my 3-year-old and 4-year-old how to garden, right? So they spend the summers in the garden, and all summer we were doing the soil, and then we saw the tomato seed turn into the plant, and like have them like, these are the things that we carry on. And like, who are we kidding? Everyone's gonna need to know how to garden. Come on now. But
Yeah.
this, like, the beautiful tradition, the knowledge, the wisdom that keeps growing is spending time with maybe not a but somebody who's like a grandparent. It's beautiful. I think Stuart's coming back on, but we're up for time. I don't know, Nick, what do you want to do?
Let's see what happens in the next couple minutes. Yeah, we are up for time, but let's just see if we will wrap up anyway, folks. Yeah. But thank you for joining us here and joining Stuart. We are terribly sorry that his internet went down. We'll blame climate change and the snow. So make sure you are better with stuff.
Yeah, be better with stuff. We'll try to continue the conversation and see what we can do.
Sounds good. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Don't forget to join us Thursday. We'll post a link on the Facebook page, or the What's on Another Cast Facebook page, about part 2 of our boundaries series of gatherings. So we'll see you on Thursday at 11 a.m. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you, Stuart. Sorry that we missed you to say goodbye, but really appreciate you being with us. And thanks, Mel. We'll talk to everybody soon.
See ya.
Bye.